James Rowe and Darren Hayes never imagined their paths would collide in a night that would change both their lives forever. One was a dedicated police officer, the other a man consumed by rage and revenge. And when Darren aimed his rifle at James, neither could predict the chain of events that would turn a quiet town into a battlefield. The town of West Haven was known for its quiet streets and sleepy neighborhoods, the kind of place where nothing much seemed to happen. Yet hidden behind the appearance of safety, darkness had been growing. For weeks, a man named Darren Hayes had been watching, waiting, and planning. He was not a stranger to violence. His life had been marked by failures, resentment, and a festering hatred for authority. Darren believed the world had wronged him, and he wanted revenge. He had chosen his target carefully. Officer James Rowe, a patrolman who drove the same route nearly every night. To Darren, Rowe represented everything he despised: the badge, the uniform, the quiet confidence of someone who stood for order. It all fueled Darren's rage. That night, the streets were silent, except for the occasional hum of a passing car. Darren crouched behind a stack of rotting crates outside an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. He had been there for hours, clutching a stolen rifle, eyes fixed on the empty road. Every sound made him tighten his grip. Every flicker of movement in the distance set his heart pounding. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times. There was no turning back now. The clock ticked past 11 when the glow of headlights finally appeared in the distance. Darren's pulse raced as the patrol car rolled closer, its engine humming softly against the stillness. He steadied the rifle, his finger hovering on the trigger. The plan was simple: fire, kill, and disappear before anyone could react. He had convinced himself that this single act would give him power, that it would finally prove he was not a man to be ignored. The car slowed as it approached the warehouse, the officer inside unaware of the danger waiting in the shadows. In one sudden burst, Darren pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, shattering the calm of the night. The windshield exploded into fragments of glass as the bullet tore into the vehicle. The car jerked, swerving violently before crashing against a lamppost. For a moment, silence returned, broken only by the ringing in Darren's ears. He expected to see the officer slump lifeless in his seat, but what happened next unsettled him. Inside the car, Officer Rowe had been struck, but he was not dead. Blood streamed down his face, his body racked with pain, yet his training took over. His trembling hand reached for the radio. Static crackled as he managed to gasp out a distress call before losing consciousness. Darren froze in shock, his stomach twisting with fear. He had imagined a clean escape, but already the wail of sirens in the distance shattered that illusion. The night erupted with flashing lights as backup units sped toward the scene. Darren's chest tightened, panic replacing the adrenaline that had fueled him. The warehouse that once felt like the perfect hideout now seemed like a cage closing in. His carefully constructed plan was unraveling in seconds. Instead of victory, he had triggered a storm that would soon consume him. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, sealing his fate. Darren turned and fled into the shadows, unaware that this single act of violence had set off a chain of events that would change everything. Darren ran through the darkness, his breaths coming in sharp bursts as he darted between empty lots and narrow alleys. The rifle weighed heavy in his hands, but he refused to drop it. Sweat stung his eyes as the sound of sirens swelled behind him, echoing across the streets like a relentless warning. He thought he had planned for every possibility, but the officer's survival had thrown everything off balance. In his mind, the police were supposed to arrive too late, left only with questions and no clear suspect. Instead, they had a wounded officer's desperate radio call, and that changed everything. As he slipped into the cover of a wooded area on the edge of town, Darren tried to steady himself. He told himself he had time, that he could still disappear if he stayed calm. Yet the town was no longer the quiet, predictable place he had stalked for weeks. Within an hour, his face was on every screen, his description broadcast on every local station. The public was warned to stay indoors, and roadblocks began appearing at every major intersection. Helicopters swept the skies with blinding spotlights, scanning the ground for any trace of him. Darren felt the noose tightening, though he tried to convince himself otherwise. The officer he had tried to kill, James Rowe, clung to life in the hospital. Though his injuries were severe, he was stable enough to give investigators details that mattered. Rowe had seen the shooter's face through the cracked glass, if only for a moment. It was enough to give police direction. They began cross-referencing records, digging into reports of anyone with grudges or violent histories. Darren's name rose to the surface quickly, his past filled with red flags, altercations at work, threats made to neighbors, and a disciplinary record that revealed a growing hostility toward authority. Back in the woods, Darren was restless. He could hear distant shouts, the barking of dogs, and the steady thrum of helicopters circling overhead. He realized he could not stay hidden forever. His nerves began to crack, and paranoia set in. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. Every light in the distance felt like it was meant for him. He considered leaving town, but the roads were crawling with patrols, and his stolen car was already known to authorities. He considered hiding deeper in the forest, but he had no supplies, no food, and no way to stay invisible for long. Meanwhile, fear rippled through West Haven. Families locked their doors. Children were kept inside, and the streets emptied as if the entire town had gone into hiding. News anchors spoke of the brazen attack on an officer, calling it an assault on the community itself. Darren had wanted recognition, but the kind he received was not the glory he imagined. Instead of power, he became a target, the man everyone wanted captured. Night bled into morning, and exhaustion began to gnaw at him. His plan to vanish was collapsing under the weight of reality. He could feel the pressure of the hunt, each hour bringing him closer to being caught. What had begun as his moment of revenge was now spiraling into desperation. Darren thought he had control, but the truth was becoming clearer with every siren in the distance. He was no longer the predator. He was the prey. Detectives gathered in the command center, a once quiet municipal building now alive with constant activity. Maps were spread across tables, red pins marking sightings and leads, while radios buzzed with updates from officers scouring the town. Darren Hayes had vanished into the night, but he hadn't disappeared completely. Traces of his movements lingered. Footprints near a creek bed, a discarded water bottle, a half-burned cigarette. Each clue pushed investigators closer, yet they knew catching him would take more than tracking. It would require strategy. The wounded officer, James Rowe, was proving invaluable. Despite his injuries, he described the face he had seen through the shattered windshield. His testimony guided detectives toward a familiar name. Darren's history was darker than most suspected. Years of failed jobs, bitter disputes, and violent tendencies painted the picture of a man spiraling into dangerous obsession. He had spoken often of hating the system, blaming police for his failures, and fantasizing about revenge. This wasn't a random act. It was the eruption of years of rage. Rather than chase Darren blindly through the woods and neighborhoods, investigators crafted a plan to pull him out of hiding. They released carefully chosen information to the media, letting it slip that Officer Rowe had not survived the attack. The lie was risky, but they believed it would lure Darren into revealing himself. A man driven by hatred and arrogance would not remain silent if he thought his mission had succeeded. The detective's gamble was that Darren would reach out to someone he trusted, someone he believed would celebrate his so-called victory with him. The trap was set, and it didn't take long for Darren to take the bait. Exhausted and paranoid, he slipped into an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town, a place he had once used as a hideaway during hard times. From there, he managed to contact an old acquaintance, a man he assumed shared his bitterness toward the world. He boasted about what he had done, his voice filled with twisted pride as he described how the officer had fallen. Darren wanted to be heard, to be recognized, to be feared. He believed he had finally proven himself. What he did not know was that his acquaintance had already been questioned by police earlier in the night. Investigators had pressed him, warning that anyone helping Darren would face charges. When Darren's call came, the man acted calm, listening carefully, but his phone was already wired. Every word Darren spoke was recorded, every location detail noted, and every slip of arrogance added to the case against him. Detectives followed the trail, their plan working exactly as intended. Darren thought he was clever, imagining he had outsmarted the police by moving through hidden routes and sleeping in abandoned spaces. Yet his movements were becoming predictable. His need to gloat, his hunger for recognition, was undoing the secrecy he had relied upon. Each boastful call narrowed the search until investigators could pinpoint where he would go next. The walls were closing in, though Darren remained blind to it. He believed he was still in control, that the police were chasing shadows while he moved freely in the dark. But the truth was that every decision he made, every word he spoke, was tightening the invisible net around him. The trap was no longer just waiting for him. It was already pulling him in. The night was heavy with silence as Darren crept back toward the warehouse where it had all begun. He thought of it as his sanctuary, a place he had used to stash supplies and plan his attack. To him, returning there was a show of control, proof that he was untouchable. He believed the police would be searching everywhere else, too distracted by false leads to consider that he might return to the very scene of his crime. His arrogance guided him forward, even as fatigue slowed his steps and paranoia gnawed at his mind. Inside the command center, investigators had already anticipated his move. The recordings from his calls had revealed his intent to gather the gear he had hidden away. Detectives knew he would eventually circle back to the warehouse. Hours of quiet preparation followed. Officers took positions around the structure, their presence hidden by darkness. Floodlights were mounted and ready, vehicles strategically placed to cut off every possible escape route. The air was thick with tension as they waited, each man and woman on edge, knowing the suspect they were about to confront had already tried to kill once and would not hesitate to do it again. Darren reached the warehouse just past midnight. The building loomed against the night sky, its rusted frame groaning with the wind. He forced the door open, the screech of metal echoing through the hollow space. He moved quickly toward the back where he had hidden supplies behind broken pallets. He imagined grabbing the bag, slipping out unseen, and surviving another day on the run. For a brief moment, he convinced himself that the chase was still in his control. Then the silence shattered. A blinding surge of white light exploded around him as the floodlights roared to life. His heart lurched as he spun, rifle in hand, but the darkness that had concealed him was gone. From every side, armed officers emerged, their steps deliberate, their presence overwhelming. The warehouse that once gave him confidence now felt like a cage, every corner sealed, every path blocked. For Darren, time seemed to slow. His mind raced through options, fight, flee, surrender, but none offered escape. His weapon trembled in his hands, sweat dripping down his face as he realized the scale of the force surrounding him. Dozens of eyes were locked on him, their training ensuring no mistakes would be made. He was not facing one lone patrolman anymore. He was facing an army united by the blood he had already spilled. Adrenaline surged as he raised his rifle, but before he could even aim, the response was instant. Tactical officers closed the distance with precision, disarming him in a matter of seconds. His weapon clattered to the ground, and he was forced onto the cold concrete floor, his arms pinned. The defiance that had carried him this far evaporated under the crushing weight of reality. His reign of control, imagined or otherwise, had ended in a heartbeat. As he was dragged from the warehouse, Darren's eyes darted wildly, searching for some sign that it wasn't over, that he still had a chance. But all he found was the reflection of flashing lights, the faces of officers who had worked tirelessly to corner him, and the cold truth that he had been caught. The man who thought he could outsmart and overpower the system was now just another prisoner in chains. The days that followed Darren Hayes' capture were marked by intense scrutiny. News crews descended on West Haven, cameras trained on the courthouse and flashing lights highlighting every angle. The story dominated headlines. The man who had tried to kill a police officer, a figure of terror, had been apprehended without anyone else being harmed. For Darren, the public attention was the opposite of what he had imagined. He had sought fear and respect, but now he became a symbol of failure, a cautionary tale broadcast for all to see. Inside the courthouse, the legal process moved with a relentless pace. Darren was shackled, led past reporters and cameras, his expression unreadable but his mind racing. He expected to assert control, to dominate the proceedings with bravado, but every step reinforced his loss of power. Evidence piled against him: surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and the recordings of his own voice boasting about the crime. The officer he had tried to kill, James Rowe, had survived and was able to testify, recounting the night of the attack in detail. His words were calm but powerful, a stark contrast to the chaos Darren had caused. Every scar on Rowe's body became proof of the violence Darren had unleashed and a reminder of the consequences of his actions. During the trial, it became clear that Darren's arrogance and obsession had been his undoing. His meticulous planning had been flawless in theory but hollow in practice. Every misstep, every overconfident move had been documented and traced. The jury watched as the story unfolded, from the ambush to the manhunt, to the carefully orchestrated sting that led to his capture. Darren had imagined a story of glory for himself, but the reality was far different. Instead of being feared, he was condemned. Instead of being remembered as powerful, he was remembered as weak, a man undone by his own rage and poor judgment. When the sentencing came, the courtroom was silent except for the formal tone of the judge. Darren was given life without parole, a sentence that confirmed the totality of his defeat. He would spend the rest of his life in confinement, stripped of the freedom and control he had once sought. Outside, families watched the verdict, relieved that justice had been served. The town of West Haven began to heal, the fear that had gripped it slowly dissipating as life returned to normal. The attempted attack, though terrifying, ultimately strengthened the community's resolve and respect for the men and women who protect it. For Officer Rowe, recovery was a slow process, both physically and emotionally. The scars on his body were matched by the memories of that night, but his survival became a testament to resilience and dedication. Darren Hayes' name faded from public discussion outside the trial, a reminder that attempts to harm others, no matter how meticulously planned, rarely end in victory. His story served as a grim lesson. Those who choose to strike at those sworn to protect will face consequences far beyond what they can imagine. The man who had once imagined himself powerful now existed only as a warning, a life consumed by his own failures, leaving behind a community forever changed but steadfast in the knowledge that justice had prevailed.